This developed into a lively discussion about what moles did compared to wizards in given situations, and the reason why some found it easy was because they had lived at home with mole parents until they had got to Hogwarts. She then allowed them to work in pairs, and they came up with other situations that mole-born wizards would find easier than other wizards, and the reasons why. Cecilia then went through the rationale, summing up the main underlying cause. She had been pretty surprised with herself when she had summed up with the reasoning the previous night and began to explain that in order to open the jar, energy was needed, either from muscles, which was provided through food, or by magic where somehow an energy transfer was taking place. Hermione said she thought it must be channeled through wands because each wand was suited to its owner, and Cecilia made a mental note to add this to her hypothesis. She concluded the lesson by briefly outlining what science was and set homework for them to find out about one famous mole about whom, in a fortnight, they would make a presentation. "Mrs. Frobisher, do you mind if I ask you a question?" said Hermione at the end of the lesson, as the students filed out. "Not at all, Hermione. If it's like you say, and everyone needs energy, how do wizards get it, and pass it on? I mean, we use spells, but you use muscular energy." Cecilia looked up briefly. "Hermione," she glanced up and beckoned Ron and Harry, who were waiting by the door for Hermione, to come forward. "I am sure I should not be talking so informally to all of you, but I need to make this clear." She lowered her voice. "You must have guessed, all three of you, the reason I am at Hogwarts." She glanced at Harry, and they nodded. "I was asked by Dumbledore to teach you what I know about moles, as a cover for the order work I am doing with Professor Snape and with you, Harry. However, there could be grave consequences should any students discover I am a mole, not least to myself." She smiled at Hermione and continued. "But I am glad you are showing an interest. I do stand by what I say. Though this may be a cover, I believe in what I am teaching you all. However, I do not have all the answers. I did not in fact know until you mentioned it, Hermione, that all wands were unique to their owners, and sadly I do not know, as yet, how wizard energy is transferred in spells. I'm working on it, though." "Will you tell us when you do find out?" asked Hermione earnestly. "Certainly I will. Now," she turned to Harry, "we need to set a regular time for a meeting. I am not sure what Professor Dumbledore has already discussed with you." "When do you need to see me, Professor?" asked Harry. "Because I have Quidditch practice most evenings." "Do you have a spare 5 minutes now? Perhaps we can look at your timetable?" She turned to Hermione and Ron. "I am entirely sure that Harry will tell you everything in any case." Harry looked across at Ron and raised his eyebrows. "But considering the circumstances, I would ask you to wait outside." "I have Tuesday evenings free," said Harry, when Hermione and Ron had left. He held out his timetable for Cecilia to see. "But I'm not sure how long that will be for, because we'll have so much work to do for our OWLs." "I'll be straight with you, Harry," said Cecilia, looking at him. "The last thing I want is to disrupt your work. However, from the point of view of the research we are doing, you are central to it, and any time you can spare will be valuable." "What has Professor Dumbledore already said to you?" "He told me to cooperate with you as much as possible," said Harry, looking back. "He said you would explain it all." "Oh dear," thought Cecilia. "There's no easy way of saying this, Harry," she said slowly, sitting down on the chair behind her desk, and exhaled. The pain, her constant companion choosing, now to bother her. "The key to the research is entirely you. Whatever it was of you that stopped Voldemort from killing you when he killed your parents. The situation that has no doubt haunted you for most of your life." Harry nodded wearily. "We do not know as yet where the research will take us, and as such the questions I may need to ask you might feel to be very personal, or painful." She paused, and looked down briefly. No one has ever done this type of work before, not even between moles and wizards to my knowledge, which is why anything you can tell me, however mundane, could be crucial. But what are you doing, Mrs. Frobisher? What do moles know that wizards don't? We are attempting to unravel the differences, the underlying cause from the point of view of mole science. She paused. When Professor Dumbledore told me that I needed to investigate the physical effects of love, I almost laughed. But you are standing there, living proof that there must be a scientific explanation for it. Harry shifted uncomfortably, but nodded. At Grimmauld Place in the summer, when we were all having tea once, Harry, I made a very crude attempt at explaining what science is. Do you remember what you said to me? I said that science was a certain way of looking at things, said Harry. I remember, Mrs. Frobisher. I understand you were at a mole school before you came to Hogwarts. He nodded. So you have some knowledge of science? We did nature at school, and some things about animals. Oh, and the teacher mentioned a scientist, Stephen Hawking. That's about all I remember. Harry sighed. To be honest, I didn't pay much attention at juniors. Science is a very powerful tool. I will be frank with you, Harry. We are to create a weapon to use against Voldemort, to stop him once and for all from harming more of us, wizards and moles. The nature of the weapon we don't know yet, though it will probably be a potion of some kind. Where Voldemort chooses to belittle moles and our ways, he loses sight of our valuable strengths, our knowledge and understanding of the world around us, science being one of them. Therefore I am sure you can understand why what we discuss is strictly confidential and that my true identity is not revealed. She looked at Harry, and he nodded slowly. Do you have any questions? Yes, Mrs. Frobisher. Am I to be working just with you, or with you and Professor Snape? Be honest with me, Harry. Do you get on with Professor Snape? Harry gave her a look and Cecilia nodded. I see, she said, smiling slightly. It will be with both of us, I am afraid. I have gathered from his character that he would probably disapprove of me discussing the research as I have done this afternoon. But I couldn't in all honesty carry this work out if you were not aware of the full facts, nor if you were less than happy to participate. It was true, despite the way she had been recruited, it was almost certain that Harry had been given little choice in assisting. Despite her magical shortcomings, she always had her professional integrity. What happens if I can't tell you something, or I can't do something? Asked Harry. I do want to help Mrs. Frobisher. Despite what Sirius did. And there it was. She thought, what was concerning Harry amongst other things. He did what he thought was in your best interests, Harry. When it comes to those we love, those bonds are the strongest. So, she brightened. Tomorrow I would like you to tell me about your family and your life before you became a wizard. Whatever you can remember, however commonplace, will help my understanding of all of this. She got up, trying to hide the pain that had grown progressively worse as they had talked, and Harry stood up too. I am happy to help, Mrs. Frobisher. I haven't thought about much else since Dumbledore spoke to me last week. It's like you said, I've lived with this all my life. Unbelievable things have happened to me. Dreadful. Extraordinary. Dangerous things. All I've ever wanted is to be normal, to have a normal life, and if Voldemort is defeated, I might be able to. As he spoke, it looked like a weight had lifted, ever so slightly from his shoulders, and Cecilia felt a surge of sympathy for this 15-year-old boy, who had been through so much. I've kept you far too long, she said, nodding towards the faces of Ron and Hermione, looking through the glass of the classroom door, and she beckoned to them. Harry smiled briefly at them. Come on, Harry, said Hermione impatiently, as they opened the door. We've got to hurry, else there won't be any half-decent books left in the library. Bloody hell, Hermione, moaned Ron. You're the only person I know who would ever say that. 88,888,888. Cecilia. Cecilia looked up from her notebook and looked around before looking down again and rereading the sentence she had written. It was probably the stress of her second day of teaching wizards, she thought, and her mind recalled the 2-inch gash in the granite classroom wall after Fred Weasley had inadvertently let go of the pickled onion jar mid-open. Cecilia. She swung her legs over the bottom of her bed, and looked round. Hello. Down here, came the voice, and her eye drifted to the chair she had put in front of the fireplace. She had put it there on Saturday night because the green splutterings had been keeping her awake, and she'd left it there because it had felt reassuring somehow. Remus! She exclaimed as she bent down between the chair and addressed his fiery head. Remus, gosh! How are you, Cecilia? Dumbledore told us about you teaching at Hogwarts. Oh, fine, she said, her stomach filling inexplicably with butterflies. This is a surprise, she added uncertainly. Heard about your run-in with Snape, chuckled Remus. Not quite seeing the funny side of you and Tonks going out? Not as such, said Cecilia, laughing. Maybe he felt a bit left out. It was amazing, she thought. They had parted on less than friendly terms, but within seconds he had managed to put her at ease. So how are you really? Said Remus, a serious tone entering his voice. This is far from what you signed up for. It's had its moments, said Cecilia. The main thing that's keeping me going is the link to my world, the Muggle world, however superficial. Research is a bit slow, though. How's everything at Grimmauld Place? I assume you're still there. How's Tonks? I haven't seen much of her these last few days. She's been at the ministry since she left you last Friday. Everything's quite quiet. Are you well? I am fine, Remus, honestly. A few twinges here and there. Thank you for asking. How's Sirius? Oh, yes, he apostrophe S. Sirius. Moping a bit since Harry left for Hogwarts. We've actually found something important, Cecilia. For your work. Raymond Lully is actually one of Sirius's ancestors. Distantly related, as it turned out. Really? She shuffled closer to the fire. I couldn't find anything out here. There's nothing in any of the books in the library. Who was he? We're not entirely sure, but it looks like he worked undercover with Muggles during the 1950s. The details are a bit sketchy, but I've told you what we found. Oh, thank you, she said eagerly, mentally speculating about this mysterious character. Like I say, it's not much. I'm sure it will really help. She swallowed. I really didn't thank you properly, Remus. Professor Dumbledore said you waited with me when I was unconscious. There was a pause. You're helping, said Remus, doing everything you can for us. There are few things nobler than selflessness, Cecilia. She laughed. It's far from that, Remus. What chance do Muggles get to investigate all this? It's a real wonder no one's done this before. Well, you really should take care, said Remus carefully. I know you are working with Snape, Cecilia, but believe me, there are many things that could still cause you harm, things you may deem innocuous. And should things get difficult, I am not entirely convinced your well-being will be uppermost in his mind. He paused. Things aren't like what they are in the Muggle world. I am well aware of that, Remus, she said carefully. But the nature of this work, it does involve awkward questions. But I trust Severus, he's being more than helpful. I mean, where would I be able to get wizard blood samples from? She smiled. Thank you for caring. And everything is all right between you? What do you mean? Well, Remus swallowed. From what you said before, when he attacked you when he was angry. That was nothing, said Cecilia. I've been through worse. She immediately regretted saying the last bit. It wasn't as if Remus wasn't patently aware of Sirius's actions. "Look," he said after a briefer pause. "I've got to go. I just wanted to tell you personally about Lully." "Thank you. Really?" She swallowed. It was ... good to see you, Remus. The fire dimmed. Really good, she thought, staring into the emptiness. 88,888,888. How dare you speak to me like that in front of the students? Especially those in my house. Snape had come to the Mole Studies classroom 20 minutes before their meeting with Harry. He had ignored her requests to leave her to prepare, and during his diatribe her exhaustion brought on from teaching another 4 lessons that day had morphed into half-hearted defense. On your first day ... the students just turned up. Did you think about how that makes me look? If you had just let me take them at the start of the lesson, but no, Mrs. Frobisher had a point to prove. Listen, Cecilia interrupted, trying to look at him as he paced around her room. I did what I was supposed to do. Professor Dumbledore wanted me to teach all the students. But when Draco Malfoy pointed his wand in my face, my choices were limited. I didn't particularly want to end up as a frog. What? Snape turned quickly. And you talk about mole prejudice. What, pray, provoked the outburst? Absolutely nothing. The other students were engaged in the lesson. Honestly, she exclaimed when she saw his skeptical expression. Admittedly, asking the students to put their wands down may have unsettled them. You did what? He stopped pacing, and bent towards Cecilia. You asked them to put their wands down? He threw down her copy of Magic and Moles, glaring at it. You empty-headed fool. Why? None of the students would need them. And besides, I thought it would be safer. You should never, ever ask a wizard to put down his wand. It's dishonorable. Demeaning. No wonder Draco wanted to go to Dumbledore. It took me a lot of effort to dissuade him. No one's ever told me that before, said Cecilia, defiantly. How was I to know? Snape snorted and folded his arms. We can't talk about this now. Harry will be with us any minute, she continued. Look. As far as I'm concerned, they don't have to come back, okay? Now, listen. She picked the book up off the floor before continuing. How far have you got with the books I gave you? She knew it was provocative, but she was past caring. The teaching was taking it out of her, and she needed Snape to refocus on the research. I may just have been able to get round to it had you not sent students to me for work, he said icily. However, I am aware that we need to proceed with this. Is there anything I can do? It was amazing, thought Cecilia, how his mood could change when she began to talk about work. She had noticed when she spoke logically to him, he changed and became more objective. The work we did, Severus, with our blood. I've given it a lot of thought, and I think the next step is in an analysis of different types. She looked at him calmly, trying to pace her excited mind in order to explain the theory she had formulated the previous night. You see, when I taught the lesson yesterday, Hermione asked me where the energy for spells comes from. Our cells reproduced in the same way under the microscope, but what happens to the blood when you, wizards I mean, perform spells? Is there a difference? And is it different for the blood types of wizards, those you call half-blood and Muleborn? And what about squibs? Snape nodded. And I assume you require me to perform spells when I get hold of the samples? Yes, that's it. I left the microscope set up at the back of your classroom under a cloak. The lens is still in focus, so all you will need to do is light the lamp manually. It will be done, said Snape, flicking up the corners of his mouth slightly. Now, I assume you have informed Potter of what is expected of him? I told him he needed to discuss with me the details of his life, his background. I need to know how he felt when he became a wizard, and before, when he lived with his family. Anyway, there's absolutely no reason to begin the practical work until you understand what I asked you to study, because I need to be able to discuss it with you. Then you won't mind if I leave you to it? Much as I would care for an hour of listening to Potter's tragic life, I can think of much better things to do with my time. Be my guest, she replied coolly as he walked towards the door. Maybe she would get a bit more of a quality interview without the inevitable interruptions. Harry may be more honest with just her. Potter, intoned Snape frostily, as Harry stepped into the classroom. Mrs. Frobisher will be conducting an interview with you this evening. Try not to bore her to death, will you? 88,888,888. At the same time that Cecilia was listening empathetically to Harry and noting down aspects of his life, a conversation of an entirely different tone was taking place in Grimmauld Place. Dumbledore held his hand to his forehead as the volume and causticity of the conversation began to escalate. It is the least you can do, Black, considering what you put her through. I am, of course, making allowances for the fact that an infinitesimal amount of loyalty has penetrated the abnormally thick head you have on your shoulders. And what about you, Snivellus? He grinned as he saw Snape rise. Oh, but I expect you haven't told her yet that you are a half-blood yourself. Want to pass off my blood as your own? Because you've only been trying to do that all your life. Gentlemen, please. Dumbledore turned to Snape. Severus, what exactly does Mrs. Frobisher need the samples for? I am taking for granted that she understands the contentious nature of her request. Not as such, Professor, said Snape, darting a look at Sirius. The samples contain what I understand to be a pattern which she can see with her instruments. What with her teaching, and my having to minimize the damage she may have caused by trying to discipline students from Slytherin House, we have barely had time to discuss it. Nevertheless, time is short, and I feel it is wise to accede to her request. But wizard blood! Exclaimed Sirius. I mean, look what happened to Harry in the summer with you-know-who. He stood up, appealing to Dumbledore as he spoke. Suppose the samples got into the wrong hands? He looked sideways at Snape, waiting for the inevitable reaction. May I interrupt, Professor Dumbledore? Mr. Weasley stepped between the two wizards. Speaking as a member of the Order, perhaps I can make a suggestion. We have trusted Cecilia thus far. We invited her to join the Order of the Phoenix, and she has demonstrated her loyalty to us and the Order many times over, despite adversities. He looked round at the small number of wizards in Dumbledore's portable office, before continuing. Severus, perhaps you could find out whether this test could be performed in any other way? I am not sure whether blood is as sacred to moles as it is to us. Maybe she has gone for the most straightforward method she knows. He glanced at Dumbledore, who nodded in acknowledgement to Arthur Weasley and gazed round at the bare bones of the Order. Snape had dropped in suddenly in order to gain his immediate consent, and the assembled company consisted of the few wizards who just happened to be there at the time. That is very perceptive, Arthur, thank you. It is a matter of blood, but I feel it is also important to provide Mrs. Frobisher with these samples if she needs them. He looked pointedly at Sirius. We have indeed bestowed on her a highly esteemed position, and it would be dishonorable not to extend our trust. If the blood is to be obtained, as Cecilia requests, it is entirely voluntary, and I do not compel you. No! Exclaimed Sirius in horror. Dumbledore, please! Giving wizard blood to a pathetic mole like her? It's abominable ... and effrontery, especially when... He stopped abruptly and fell silent, glancing over to Remus. Severus, what samples does she need? I assume she has some of yours. Dumbledore looked at Snape. She has, said Snape stiffly. She needs a purer blood sample, half-blood, and mole-born. Also a squib. And, he looked across at Sirius, his eyes narrowing, she'll probably need a sample from Harry. Moving almost automatically, Dumbledore took a step forward between Snape and Sirius, looking at them both and waiting for the soundless explosive atmosphere to subside before continuing. "I understand," he said slowly, "that Cecilia has sought permission from Harry for this research. Therefore she had demonstrated a high level of integrity." He looked pointedly at Sirius. "Should she require Harry's blood, it is clear to me she will obtain it with his permission. Harry is no longer a child, Sirius. He is participating of his own volition. You can have my blood." A voice rang out firmly from the back of the room, breaking the silence. "That is very good of you, Remus," said Dumbledore. "However, have you considered that Cecilia may discover your condition?" "Yes, I know," said Remus slowly. "But my offer still stands, if it is of any use." He looked across at Snape. "I would urge caution," said Snape. "She does not believe werewolves exist, and I would not like to introduce too many complications into the work." "In that case," said Dumbledore, "a sample of my own will give you the purer blood sample, and with your own you have the half-blood." Sirius sniggered, then attempted to cover it up as a cough. "We just need a Mulborn sample then," said Mrs. Weasley. "And Squib," added Kingsley Shacklebolt. "I'm sure Arabella will be more than happy to oblige." "As will I," said Sturgis Podmore. "You're right, by the way, Arthur. Mole blood is not sacred to them. My parents used to donate when they could. They transfer it to one another when they are ill." Molly Weasley turned her nose up in disgust. "It's marvelous how practical moles can be," said Dumbledore. "Now, when does she need these samples for, Severus?" "As soon as possible, however. "What about other methods?" interrupted Molly. "If she can test with other samples, maybe you wouldn't need to take blood?" Snape nodded slightly. "I will attempt to ascertain this," he said, surveying the wizards. "However, I do hope that we will not experience such hostility if blood is needed." However, thought Sirius, should an entirely different set of circumstances alter the height of the Quidditch posts, there will be no need for hostility. 88,888,888. Cecilia was thankful when it got to the weekend. The week had gone pretty well on the whole, and she had managed to contain most of the lessons and, most importantly, they had been well received. Most of the students had appeared well behaved and, apart from the dwindling numbers of students from Slytherin House, the rapport was, on the whole, good. Equally, there had been some interesting adverse situations. In the fifth year's third lesson, last thing yesterday, Ron was on fire, literally, when she had asked him to light a match. And there had been a fierce debate between Anthony Goldstein and Lavender Brown over the relative merits of Mole historical achievements. Despite her reservations, she had actually begun to enjoy teaching, and it seemed the lessons were well received. Today she had come to the potions classroom for a meeting with Snape. He had informed her yesterday as they passed in the corridor momentarily that he had read the book about cells and DNA, and had arranged to meet her today. However, he had omitted to tell her the time. Never mind, she thought, as she leafed through Hogwarts, a history for what must have been the 100th time. She could spend the time profitably by continuing with her chemical analysis of Snape's potion ingredients. Since she had been shanghaied as a teacher, she had barely looked at the research, much less done any practical work. Carefully, she uncorked a jar labeled lacings, and began to chop them, considering the interesting conversation she'd had with Harry after the lesson. He had been very honest with her on Tuesday, and had detailed the extraordinary events of his life, and she had idly mused that it had the makings of a best-selling series of books. At one point, she even had to make an excuse to leave the room for a few minutes in order to compose herself after he had described how he had been tricked by a fake Mad-Eye Moody, and how Wormtail, the friend of his father, Sirius and Remus, had killed Cedric Diggory, how the Death Eaters had appeared when Wormtail had regenerated Voldemort using Harry's blood. It had only been when she had returned that he had explained that it was his aunt who offered protection to him while he was underage. His mother's sister had the protection in her blood, the ancient spell that had protected Harry when he was a baby. That had been the most interesting part. Petunia Dursley sounded like a typical person with a secret, keeping up appearances to her neighbors, trying desperately to hide the skeletons of her past under linen tablecloths and gloss-finished woodwork. But what protected Harry? She was not a witch herself, and her parents were muggles. What exactly was it? Ow! Cecilia's mind suddenly returned to the present and she looked down at what she'd tried to cut instead of a lacing. Mrs. Frobisher, I was wondering whether you were busy. She turned to see Hermione, standing half in, half out of the classroom. Sorry if I made you jump, she added, looking down at Cecilia's bleeding finger. Come in, Hermione, she said, sucking her finger. What can I do for you? I was wondering, Mrs. Frobisher, I wanted to know. She looked around at the table behind Cecilia. Are you doing science? Yes, said Cecilia, nodding slightly. Research. Hermione looked back at her. I've always been fascinated. I've got some books that were my father's. He worked for a company called Marconi before he became a dentist. He gave them to me before I came here. All that knowledge, the excitement of discovering. She pulled a tissue from her pocket and gave it Cecilia. For your finger. I've always wondered what it would have been like, being at a muggle school. Hermione's eye wandered to the table of ingredients again. I know it seems strange, but I've always wanted to know what it would have been like if I had gone to Wilchester Community School. I was home educated, so I didn't go to juniors. Mum let me choose. I almost did too. I almost went to Wilchester. I had to run up the road to stop her posting back the letter to Dumbledore saying no. It sounds strange, but I just had to come here. Hermione looked around the classroom and Cecilia recognized the same contemplative undertones she had used herself. So hard to put into words. Almost as if the alternative was unthinkable once you knew about the world of wizards. And though I am sure I made the right choice, there's a little part of yourself that just wants to know what it would have been like, finished Cecilia. Hermione nodded. What was it like at school for you, Mrs. Frobisher? I enjoyed school, though it wasn't the same for everyone. Cecilia smiled as she sat down on one of the student benches. But for me, there got to a stage, especially with science, that if I were to miss a single thing it would have been the end of the world. Me too, said Hermione, sitting next to her. That's what I feel like here. I would have liked to have gone, repeated Hermione wistfully. At least at a muggle school I wouldn't be called a mudblood every day. There's prejudice in the muggle world too, said Cecilia. Here you have every creed of person, anyone who is magical is accepted here. She got to her feet, her muscles had begun to ache again. In the our world anyone who is different, at one stage or another, has been persecuted by other people who believe they are better, fitter, stronger, cleverer, more pious. I think that our fear and ignorance of people who are different to us is what muggles and wizards have most in common. But I think you'll all experience what it's like being in a muggle school from my lessons. My dad told me about the subjects he took, including science. I asked him about it when I went home to pack this summer. He said it was just like potions. Well, perhaps not quite as exciting as that, chuckled Cecilia. School was very similar to here. We have exams, concerts, lessons, sports, hanging out, watching the boys play football and giggling about them. Hermione shot her a worried look. I never had friends until I came here, she said. I hardly met anyone at home, only my tutor and her daughter, and if it hadn't been for Harry and her Ron, I think it would be the same here. Anyway, thank you, it's been nice chatting, sorry to keep you. Not at all, said Cecilia. It had been nice chatting to Hermione too, despite the girl's natural tendency to speak to her as an adult. Oh, Hermione held out her hand. "Harry asked me to give you this." Cecilia looked down and took the folded papers from her. She unfolded them carefully, and glanced down at the top sheet, which began, "Dear Harry." "Hermione," called Cecilia, but it was too late. She looked at the pages underneath, and the words, "Raymond Lully," sprang out from the page. "Remus," thought Cecilia, "thank you." She glanced to the bottom of the letter to Harry, and realized she was mistaken. The pages weren't from Remus, but Sirius. Perhaps she would have been more productive that day if she hadn't read the letter. If she hadn't read it, she might have missed what she would come to regard as a very important piece of information. But, despite her best intentions, she did. "Harry, I hope this letter finds you in good health. Dumbledore tells me you have conceded to participate in the Mrs. Frobisher's research. I know what I said before you left for school, but I must impress on you that what you are doing is indeed very honorable thing. Endeavor if you can to discover the true nature of intent, and should anything happen to me, you are the only hope for the Order. I enclose 2 pages from the Black family tome which may assist Mrs. Frobisher. Tell her I know nothing more than what is written. Lully was a distant relative who worked with Muggles, so it is little wonder my mother never spoke of him. Just remember not to do anything foolish that would put yourself in danger. I would strongly advise you to remember what is in the blood, as the limit of her conception is her weakness. She is a Muggle, after all. I am proud of you, Harry, as would be your father. Sirius." Cecilia read the letter through again. It seemed simple enough, and his care for Harry pervaded every sentence. But what did he mean by remembering what's in the blood? And what about that veiled attempt to disparage her? The limit of her conception is her weakness. Glancing over the pages from Sirius's book, she folded them in half and threw them in her pocket. Her eagerness to analyze the potions samples had faltered, the sentence form Harry's letter having replaced objectivity. "How dare you, Sirius," she said to herself, as she made her way back to her room. "What do you know of it?" She turned the knob of the door and sat down on the bed. She is a Muggle, after all. Well, sod you, Black. I don't treat these children any different because they think that 10 minutes is a good time for tying shoelaces. "And when are you going to make an appearance, Severus?" she said aloud, looking at the door in case magic happened to be a disease you caught and a fully educated Snape would walk right in now. When it didn't happen, Cecilia unfolded the paper again. She should really return this to Harry, taking the letter off the top of the pile, but then she glanced down at the sentences again, willing herself not to read the sentence about her. The true nature of intent. She glanced across the page. Remember what is in the blood. What is in the blood? Quickly. She knelt down and pulled out Mysterious Mythology from under her bed. Cecilia recalled a story that had contained just those words. Remember what is in the blood. She leafed over the first few pages. Grimelda. The Princess and the Every Flavor Bin. The House Elves and the Wand Maker. Where is it? She said aloud, scanning from page to page. Then she stopped, and gasped in horror. 3 pages were missing from the book. And what was more horrific was they had been torn out, the fibers of the pages hanging limply close to the spine. Cecilia turned the book to the front and exclaimed aloud. The title of the story had been obliterated. A small burn mark, in the exact shape of the letter outline, betrayed its assaulted state. However, she didn't need to know the title. In her first lab notebook, when she was recuperating at Grimmauld Place, she had made notes and speculations about the stories, when she had decided to give it back to Remus. Looking inside her desk drawer, she found the notebook underneath the pile of new notes she had made. There it was, page 394, she had written. A story about knowledgeable industrialists who met once a month, when the moon was full, in order to exchange stories about their technological pursuits. She had written underneath, the stories grew taller and taller, and they would demonstrate their more ludicrous ideas. She looked up. Why on earth would anyone ... and more to point, how did someone do this? Who had come in here? The book had been under her bed since she had got back to Hogwarts 3 weeks ago. Who would do what? A voice was addressing her from the corner of the room. Cecilia put her notebook down and made towards the chair. Remus? Watcher. Who would do what, Cecilia? Oh, Tonks, said Cecilia. I've just been reading Mysterious Mythology. She gestured to the bed. But, oh God, some of the pages have been removed ... torn out. Remus's book? Asked Tonks. I thought you said you were giving it to him back. I was, sighed Cecilia. He told me to keep it. I said it was a long-term loan. Who would do such a thing? I don't know, but if I know Remus, he won't be too bothered. It could easily have been a spell. Anyway, some books have articles and stories that self-destruct. Copyright. She added airily. How are you, anyway, apart from stressing over work? I don't think it's that good for you. To be on the go the whole time, you need some time to relax. It's what I thrive on, said Cecilia, looking back over to Mysterious Mythology. Self-destructing stories? Well, anything's possible here, I suppose. Talking from experience? Asked Cecilia, settling down cross-legged in front of the fire. Remus said you were busy. You've talked to Remus? Yes. He popped his head in on Tuesday, said Cecilia. Literally, she added, chuckling. It's good to see you, Tonks. I wanted to thank you for last week. The 3 broomsticks was just what I needed. It was great, wasn't it? Said Tonks, excitedly. We'll have to do it again sometime, that is, if you think you can handle Snape and his warm and welcoming ways. Cecilia giggled. Mrs. Frobisher, is that butterbeer in your hand? Oh dear, I do hope you've brought enough for all of us. Tonks broke into hysterics at Cecilia's imperfect impression of Snape. We've definitely got to do that again. Anyway, how's the work? Snape mentioned you were going to test wizard blood. That's right, said Cecilia. But fat lot of use that will be unless Snape actually gets his arse in gear and gets through some of the theory. I never thought I would say this, Tonks, but this is the first time I'm actually at a dead end. She sighed. I need him to understand science because it ties in with magic. I can't do the magic that I need for these tests. That's what's slowing it all down. Is there any other way of testing for what you're looking for? I mean, if you're looking at different types of wizards. She paused, as Cecilia gave her a puzzled look. Snape, admitted Tonks. Heavens, Cecilia, do you lot get taught that look when you're training to be teachers? It's like ... well ... you could have asked me anything. Cecilia arched her eyebrow. He mentioned you using an instrument, a device, looking for patterns in blood. Cellular reproduction, said Cecilia, annoyed. You see what I mean? He needs to understand about genetics and DNA so we can proceed with this. She glanced at Tonks. I can use other samples, such as hair, but it's the tests we need to go through. A hint of uncertainty entered her voice. What's the matter? Asked Tonks. Nothing, said Cecilia, shaking her head. It's been a long day. Look, Tonks, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to bore you. You're not, said Tonks, kindly. I just wish I understood what you were talking about, that's all. What would it take to test hair samples? Is it complicated? A bit, said Cecilia. You see. But you don't see, she thought sadly. If only I was working with Nick. Nick? Said Tonks. My research colleague, when I worked in the mole world as a scientist. We got on well, it was like we could have a laugh. She paused, thinking of Nick ... the night shifts, the pranks and practical jokes. He was such a good friend. No, I'd need to go back to a mole laboratory to test the hair. I'd have to call Nick and arrange it. A thought entered her mind. Then I could visit home, she thought, make sure everything was all right. And the detail would be far superior. Well, if you need someone to come with you, you only have to ask, she winked. So, when do you want to go out again? I can't see it being any time soon, said Cecilia, sighing. I really need to get to the bottom of this. It's so frustrating. I'll be 29 and we'll still be on binary fission and mitosis, I fear. When's your birthday? Sounds like the ideal time for a drink, said Tunks, eagerly. Is that all you think about? Laughed Cecilia. October. The 8th. A Monday, so I can't go out drinking all night. Well, it's decided then. I won't take no for an answer. In that case. Yes. Tunks and Cecilia chatted for a bit longer, and it was only when Tunks said she had to go on a duty that they broke off, and Cecilia was left feeling somewhat buoyant. Tunks always managed to do that. Just like Remus had a few days before, and she mused at how suited they were for each other. Two personable people. Right, she thought, feeling somewhat annoyed that Snape hadn't shown up. I'm going to have a bath. She grabbed her shampoo and felt the cool air on her bare flesh, anticipating the warming pampering she would now indulge in. Just as she pushed open the bathroom door, Sirius's head appeared in the hearth. He smiled as he realized he could see into the room. Cecilia had neglected to replace the chair, and he scanned the room, noticing the door swung closed behind her. Does it occur to you that spying on her is wrong? He asked himself, when she's doing a favor for the Order. But she was so his gaze caught her nightie draped over the end of the bed. He mentally cleared his throat. She was a mole, goddammit, who could be doing Merlin knows what to Harry. He scanned the room again. Anything else was just a bonus. He jumped as the door opened. Cecilia. Snape strode into her room. This. He held a book in his hand, then looked round the room for the absent Cecilia. Sirius opened his mouth to call out as Snape made his way towards the bathroom, then closed it again. This was an upside, definitely. The bathroom facilities, thought Cecilia as she massaged shampoo into her hair. Well, that's better than last week. 2 more positives. Maybe she was getting used to this, bellowed Snape. How dare you give me this. This child's book. Cecilia jumped as Snape thundered into the bathroom. I suppose you think that's funny. After all, moles are supposed to have a weird sense of humor. He stared at her, exigently. No, said Cecilia, how dare you? There's nothing whatever wrong with the book. It's got everything you need to know. Anyway, listen, she began. Harry. Pa. Snape threw the book onto the bathroom floor. You did that deliberately, didn't you? After what I said to you last week. Of all the... Actually no. I'm not that petty. We would have been miles ahead with our research by now if you'd only just bothered to. It was Snape, in here, and she was in the bath. Oh God. That is not there. He glanced at her, then lowered his gaze. If you just... Right. In there. She pointed towards the bathroom door quickly. Without looking back, he walked hastily through it. 10 minutes later, Cecilia peered round the door. Snape was sitting, with his back towards her, head bent over her book. Dressing gown round her tightly, she scuttled behind the wardrobe, throwing open the door. Tell me again, Severus, what you were saying about the book. I presume then, that you have read it now? He turned quickly. Cecilia? He cleared his throat. Mrs. Frobisher? His voice had lost some of its bitterness. Just here, she said, leaning round the corner of the wardrobe door, hair still wrapped up in a towel. He swallowed. I can see now why I needed to read it. Tell me, do mole children really learn about this at 12? Cecilia nodded as she sat herself down. Jeans and t-shirt was so much more suitable than birthday suit. Listen, I didn't mean to insult you. I knew you were busy. This was the most suitable book and you've managed it in week. My word, thought Cecilia. I think that really shocked him. A day, actually. So, how does this relate to the blood samples? You've got them? Cecilia got up, shaking off her towel, and began to brush her hair. She moved the tall chair back in front of the fire and sat down on it. Yes, said Snape, glancing at her. Not physically as yet, but they're on their way. However, there is something you must understand. Wizard blood, it is precious, unique. It can be used by wizards in binding spells, compelling other wizards to do their bidding. He paused. Being a wizard, it truly is in the blood. That is the exact reason I wanted you to conduct the research, said Cecilia levelly. She looked down. Look, about Draco Malfoy, I really didn't know about wands. Admittedly, I didn't think either. I have contained it, said Snape, coldly. Do not concern yourself with it, Cecilia. Now, you mentioned Mr. Potter, perhaps you could enlighten me? Cecilia paused. Okay. This is it? As close to the slate being wiped clean as it was possibly going to get, and they spent the next half an hour discussing her theory, and she had to admit, Snape had picked up the everything and more from his short study session. She was actually impressed. But, as usual when things were going well, Murphy and his legislation always made an appearance to make the well turn into not well. It was only when Cecilia realized she had compared moles favorably to wizards that not well turned into catastrophic. You can't seriously expect me believe that Dumbledore will allow you to visit Potter's relatives and obtain a blood sample? There has to be another way. There is, said Cecilia. I could take a hair sample. If one of the Order were to visit the Dursleys, get hold of some, then I could have that analyzed. How? You've already said that blood is the only way to test magical energy. Does this involve another children's book? She could detect the bitterness in his voice. DNA fingerprinting. She returned to the bathroom and retrieved the book Snape had thrown on the floor. This will give us more insight into the link between Harry and his aunt. I mean, have you never thought why this has transferred? The fingerprint relates to amino acids, and we can see which have been inherited. But you haven't got this equipment, said Snape, pointing to the picture. I agree, it certainly would add to our knowledge and understanding. We can't do it here, though. I've already thought of that, said Cecilia. Nick, my former colleague. He thinks I'm working for the patent office in London. He knows the work's confidential, and won't ask questions. All I'll need is a sample of purer blood hair for comparison. Then we'll know for sure. He nodded, then stopped abruptly. Why are you telling me this? Asked Snape, getting up, suddenly looking uneasy. Why do you think? It wouldn't need much. She looked across his hair. If you cut it from underneath, it wouldn't be seen. She stopped, looking at his expression. His face was pale, his eyes beady, analyzing her. You presume too much, he said, in a voice like liquid nitrogen pouring over granite, rubbing his left forearm, and glancing down. Glancing at her sharply, he turned and hurried out. Wah, said Cecilia, as the door closed. She crossed the flagstone floor lightly, and watched him stride swiftly down the corridor. Not this time, she said aloud, and, grabbing a cardigan and a pair of shoes, Cecilia hurried after him.